Hello, we're at the end of David's life. Today we're going to be talking about a man after God's own heart who finished well. Last session we finished up for 2 Samuel. We've gone all the way from 1 Samuel through all of 2 Samuel, but his life's not complete unless we talk about 1 Kings, chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. David's an old man now. 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. I say he's an old man, but this time King David was only 70. Believe me, 70 should not be that old, except David had lived a hard life. A hard life as a military man, full of wear and tear, both in his body, having mental overload. Can you imagine overseeing the troops? The thousands of people, the kingdom, making the decisions as ruler, as governor, as city magistrate. And then he was just prematurely exhausted. When we think about leaders today, there's not many like Queen Elizabeth that reign for their entire life. More like our presidents that rule 4, possibly 8 years at a time, and then that's it. David lived his whole life this way. Well, as an old man, and he was getting older, and he found out that, like a lot of old people, he just couldn't get warm, and there were no thermostats to turn up in that palace. So it was recommended that a young virgin by the name of Abishag be given to him. Not that they would really have relations, but that she was to care for him. She was to nurse him, and she was to sleep with him to keep his body warm. And Abishag did become a concubine or secondary wife to David. Well, while all of that was going on, David's son, Adonijah, was there in the picture. Adonijah was the 4th son of Solomon. And it said that he had Solomon's kingly manners, good looks. And as the 4th son, the first 2 were dead. We're not sure what happened to the 3rd one. This makes him what appeared to many to be next in line for the throne. And David saw his actions and that he was beginning to act like the heir apparent, but didn't say anything to anyone. Did not try to stop him. One thing we have learned about David, he was a very lenient father. And his silence in this case led the people, and most probably Adonijah, to assume that David planned on him being king. Adonijah saw that Dad's getting older. I don't know how much longer he's going to be around, and nothing's been said about giving me the crown. And there's Solomon to think about. I don't know. Maybe he intends to give it to Solomon. So what did Adonijah do? Took matters into his own hands and decided he needed to take decisive steps. He planned his own coronation party. He invited some 2 very prominent people. First of all was Joab. Joab, the commander of the army, the one who had been loyal to David in a very disloyal way for many years, was easily dissuaded to come over to Adonijah's side. Perhaps he was still hurting and stinging from David when he tried to replace him with Amasa, and wanted to make sure that in case Solomon became the next king, he would not be replaced. Then there was Abiathar. Abiathar, he was a priest, and as a priest, he had just as much control over the priests and the Levites as Joab had over the soldiers. This was a very important position, and Abiathar also had been very loyal to David in the past. So he now has 2 followers. But who did Adonijah not invite? Well, he didn't invite Zadok, who worked right alongside of Abiathar and had been the high priest back in the days of Saul. He was a loyal follower of David's. He did not invite Nathan the prophet. Nathan, the one who confronted David about his sin with Bathsheba and became a loyal subject and faithful friend, held in the highest esteem by David ever since that time. He didn't invite some of David's other well-known people or even David's bodyguard. But in spite of these people not being invited, Adonijah had a great feast. A great feast that was common to the ascension of any new throne, any new person ascending the throne. It was a great public event in which he invited everyone from the great to the commoners. And it was probably a feast purely of political reason that everybody might know, or at least assume, that David had appointed him and that he wanted to secure his crown. Verses 11 through 14 let us know that Adonijah's coronation and his planned rebellion was defeated by the prophet Nathan. Nathan knew God's plan. He knew God's will. He knew that Solomon was supposed to be the one to reign on the throne. And knowing that, he did everything he could to see that that fact was accomplished. And so he arranged for Bathsheba to go in and see David. He said, Bathsheba, this is what's happening. Adonijah is about to take over the kingdom. And if he does, you and your son will die. Go and remind David of the promise that he made to you. And see if he really knows what's going on. Verses 15 and 16, that's just a great narrative of David's court at that time. Bathsheba was David's favored wife. And in spite of Abishag, she still had favor with the king. But she, as the queen, could not just walk into his presence. She had to get permission to enter. But once she did, King David looked at her and says, what do you want? Tell me what's on your heart. This was a king who loved his wife. And in verses 17 through 22, Bathsheba informs David of Adonijah's plan to take over the throne. Then she reminded David that if a king dies without first appointing a successor, then the oldest son will take his place. This is the way it was in all of the other lands around them. This was the way it had been planned with Saul and Jonathan. And it was not until God had divinely spoken through a word of prophecy that he revealed his plan that the succession of the throne would not go to the next in line, but it would go to Solomon, a man of peace. Solomon, a man who would build the temple. And David had made this plan known to Bathsheba. It was known probably throughout the kingdom. And the fact that neither Bathsheba nor Solomon were invited to Adonijah's coronation meant that if he did take the throne, both of those would be seen as rivals and would probably be put to death. Everyone was waiting. What's the king think? What's he going to do? Is this really the one he's chosen? Well, about that time, verse 22 and through 27 lets us know that Nathan came in just as they had planned. And he confirmed everything that Bathsheba had told David, including the fact that, Joab and Abiathar were invited. And he listed all those who were not invited. It appears that Bathsheba left when Nathan came in, but the king called her back right away. And he renewed his pledge to her in very impressive terms, which showed that the aged king had aroused himself again to the duty of the emergency. He was still a king, and weak, old, and feeble. He was going to do what God had called him to do. So verses 32 through 40 show us how David had Solomon anointed. He said, I believe your story, and he was going to take action to immediately have a coronation for Solomon. He said, call the state mule. All the king's sons, all the princes rode a mule, but there was one mule that only the king could ride upon. Under penalty of death, no one but the king could sit on this mule. And David said, I want Solomon there. He can go for a ride. And so Solomon riding the mule was a public declaration of David's favor on him as future king. David then selected a place that was equally as public as the place that Adonijah had chosen for his coronation. And then David said, all right, we've had the coronation, now come back. Sit on my throne. And this was a public recognition again that he had Solomon succeed him even while he was alone, and David and Solomon reigned together. Zadok had anointed Solomon with the anointing oil. The horns were blown. And it said the people were rejoicing, and the crowds of thousands screaming out, long live King Solomon, spread throughout the land, all the way to where Adonijah and his followers were meeting. That news reached him in verses 41 through 49. We see what happened. Adonijah and his followers they were celebrating and they were having a feast. But then Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, shows up. He has full news of what went on at that coronation. He told him everything. And then Adonijah, Joab, Abiathar, and all the other rebels said they quit eating. They lost their appetite. And they took off, each one fleeing for his own life. Adonijah fled too. In verses 50 through 53 of chapter 1 of 1 Kings says that he fled to the altar. He caught hold to the horns of the altar erected there on Mount Zion. Now, this is very significant because he went to the place where his buddy, his co-conspirator, Abiathar, was acting as high priest. Now, the horns of the projectiles were on the four corners of the altar. And on these places, that's where the sacrifices were bound and where each one was tipped in blood. And Adonijah took hold of one and he was pleading for mercy, which seems normal because these horns were a symbol of grace and salvation to the sinner. And it was regarded as a sanctuary, but not a sanctuary to the murderers, to the rebels, or to the deliberate perpetrators. Adonijah, having acted in opposition to the will of the reigning king, was guilty of rebellion. And it was Solomon and not David who spared Adonijah's life. Adonijah was taken from the altar. He appeared before Solomon and bowed there. And what he was doing, he was paying respect. He was paying homage to Solomon as the new king of Israel. The king sent him home. to live a very private and quiet life, a life in which he would not interfere in the kingdoms of state or in the kingdoms of the court. 1 Kings, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 11, give us the details of David's death and what happened just before then. Just before he died, he gave Solomon a solemn charge. He starts by telling Solomon his time of death is approaching, and he orders Solomon to be strong and be a man. He says, stand up for yourself. You're going to need fortitude and strength if you're going to rule the kingdom and discharge all of the difficult decisions that you have to make in your duties as a king. And David knew that the only way to do this was to keep God's law and all of the ceremonial, all of the moral, and all of the political requirements. Only by this would he ever secure God's blessings in his reign. And then David referred to the promise of perpetuality in his lineage. He says, if you do this, the kingdom, this family will go on and on forever and ever. And then David takes a turn. And he says, you know what Joab did. He brings up Joab's name. And the conduct of Joab, who was both David's nephew and the commander of his army, while it was offensive to David personally, especially in the way he handled the death of David's son Absalom and in murdering Amasa, whom David had set to replace him. This was terrible. I mean, David was greatly offended by this. But more than that, Joab had danger of bringing reproach upon the character, upon the future, and the ability to endanger the throne of David. He looked at it as being outside of himself. And so without mentioning his personal injuries, he dealt with the assassination of Abner and Amasa and says, son, you better act with wisdom. David knew Joab's power, the influence that he had over all of the armies of Israel. And he knew that in his lifetime it was greater at the end than he could even deal with. He said, but you need wisdom to take any action against him. Use wisdom and forethought. And then he goes on in verses 8 and 9. And Shimei, that rebel who had cursed David when he was running from Absalom there by the creek. He'd done that in front of all of David's mighty men and all of David's followers when he was at a place of heartbreak and distress. Though David's pardon to Shimei, which was enforced by the presence of 1,000 men, could not be refused, he warned Solomon of the violent, dangerous character of this man. And he says, I want you to be aware and I want you to use wisdom because Shimei will commit offenses in the future. Think about how you're going to handle them. In these 9 instructions that David gave regarding these 2 men, he was not exhibiting a vindictive spirit. He was acting in the character of a king and a leader who noticed the crimes that he had not been able to deal with himself. But yet he pointed out the persons whom the new king would find necessary to deal with in only ways that he could, because these represented a danger to the state. Verses 11 and 12 lets us know that David died just months, and we don't know how many months it was, if it was 6 months, 8 months, 48 months. He died after Solomon's coronation. But we do know that during that interval, David spent developing his ideas and his plans for the future glory of the kingdom. And he wanted to provide for the permanent worship of God. Acts 13:36 says, "For David, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell asleep and was buried with his fathers." David fulfilled God's will, and then God allowed him to die. And God has a purpose for you. And it doesn't matter what anyone says. It doesn't matter how long or how short your life has been. The end will not come for you until you fulfill God's purpose. David, we've looked at his life, and you've heard me talk a lot about how I view David, but how did God really evaluate David? What was God's perception? God saw him as a man who possessed integrity and uprightness. 1 Kings 15:5 says, "Because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite." And every other sin we see David committing, he immediately confessed, he immediately repented and said, "Take away this iniquity." The thing with Uriah and Bathsheba went on and on and on. Finally, God had to send a prophet to confront him. He said, "But he did everything. He didn't let go of anything that I asked him to do. Everything I told him to do, he did that." And he was a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel 13:14 and Acts 13:22 says, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart who will do all my will." A man after God's own heart. The son of Jesse. And later on, he had a very famous son. More famous even than Solomon. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, known as the Son of David. He wasn't just referred to the Son of David by the angels. He wasn't just referred to as the Son of David by writers of the New Testament. He was referred in the book of Revelation twice, 2 times. One of heaven's elders was talking to John as he wrote the book of Revelation. And in Revelation 5:5 it says, "But one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals.'" Oh, but again, farther on in Revelation, you know what? Chapter 22. That's about as far in Revelation as you can almost get. Jesus himself had something to say. Verse 16, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to those in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright and morning star." Jesus himself said, "I come from David. I'm the seed of David. I'm the son of David." David, the most famous king of Israel, he was referred to in 28 books of the Bible. If you look at a King James listing of the Bible, you'll find his name 1,118 times. David had such an impact upon the nation. And as we close out his life, look back over how David, one man, had such an impact for God in the little things he did. When he was a shepherd boy, taking care of his sheep. When he was a soldier. When he was a king. Even as an old man who was still a leader. He touched the lives of people because he allowed God to touch him. And as we close David's life, that's my challenge for you. Allow God to touch your life so that in turn you will be able to touch the lives of others.